What if God whispered a promise into the ear of a people standing at the edge of everything they had been waiting for, and that promise would not be fulfilled until the faces of a whole generation had been replaced by another? Picture a land thick with harvest, vines too heavy for a single man to lift, and cities rimmed with walls that climbed like cliffs toward the sky. Picture two men who heard that whisper as clearly as a drumbeat in their chests, men who would spend their lives refusing to let sight write the story faith had already begun. This is the epic adventure of Joshua and Caleb in the Promised Land. The scene opens with a nation stretched thin by wandering, exhausted, expectant, raw from miracles. They had seen waters part and close like a curtain, watched flames that pursued enemies, and tasted manna that fell as bread from heaven. Yet miracles had produced a people as capable of doubt as of praise. Moses stood at the center, a shepherd turned lawgiver, a mediator who had walked face to face with the presence of God. Before the people lay Canaan, earth that belonged to them by promise, not by conquest, a country whose orchards and fields were already planted by strangers, whose cities bristled with defenders, whose pastures were lush with milk and honey. To claim it, God commanded reconnaissance, send 12 men, leaders from each tribe, to spy out the land and bring back a report. They went as scouts, not as conquerors. 12 pairs of boots on a 40-day journey. 40 days, a number that already carried weight in that people's story. 40 days had been the rhythm of testing and of revelation. They moved through a landscape that contradicted rumor. Into the valley of Eshcol they came, where the cluster of grapes bent the vine into a burden too large for one man to carry. They took it on a pole between two men, a visible, almost absurd proof that the soil of Canaan bore fruit like a promise planted in the ground. Figs, pomegranates, and olives painted the valleys. Towns with walls and fortified gates crowned the hills. The spies kept their eyes open. They returned with evidence and with impressions. They brought back bowls heavy with fruit and stories light with fear. At first, their voices described abundance, a land flowing with milk and honey. They showed what could be had. The people tasted the place in their mouths through grape-sweet flesh and smelled possibility. But inside the same mouths a different sound began to grow, a small but poisonous conjunction. But that two-letter word cleaved the camp. 10 of the spies chose to play the future by sight. They reported fortresses, giants, Anakim, men whose size seemed to press the horizon into a different order. They said the cities were fortified and very great, and the people were strong. They described themselves as grasshoppers in the presence of those who towers over them. Their account was cinematic in its terror. Walls that reached the sky, defenders like trees in a forest, a people unfamiliar with being dispossessed. The images they offered delivered panic, and the panic began to breed in the assembly like rot. Fear is contagious. It speaks in the grammar of survival. The camp listened, and the story of the land shifted from harvest to hazard. But not all eyes saw the same thing. 2 men returned with a different cadence. Joshua, called the son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, stood in the dust of that assembly and refused to let the camp reframe the promise by what the world appeared to be. Their testimony did not deny the existence of giants or formidable walls. It refused to let appearance have the last word. "Let us go up," they said, words that were small in syllable but volcanic in consequence. "We are well able to overcome it." Where 10 had measured everything through the prism of human limitation, Joshua and Caleb measured it against the promise God had spoken. There is a kind of courage that emerges only when memory of God's past faithfulness outshines the immediate danger. Joshua had been Moses' attendant, a silent apprentice whose life had been formed in the presence of God's cloud and spoken law. Caleb had been marked by a trust that did not age with circumstance. Their assurance sounded like an accusation to a frightful crowd. The assembly, listening to the chorus of doom, turned their faces with anger. Where testimony of hope appears, a people can either be jolted awake or lunge to silence the witness. In that moment, the camp chose the latter. The rage that rose among them was not merely irritation. It was the combustible fear of a people who preferred the safety of staying put to the risk of receiving what God had promised. Imagine the sound, hundreds of voices swelling, not in worship but in the roar of rebellion, the rumble of accusation. Joshua and Caleb found themselves at the center of it. They rent their garments, an ancient public sign of grief and protest, and urged the people to trust the one who had been faithful in every season of their wandering. They spoke with the authority of those who had seen God move. Yet the crowd advanced toward them with the intent to stone, to reject not only the men, but the very idea that promise could outrun present danger. Here, the narrative tightens into a crisis. The children of Israel had become a people choosing immediate security over the risk of promise. The assembly's fear flung them into rebellion. Some spoke of returning to Egypt. Others wanted to appoint a new leader to take them back into the familiar. The murmurs grew into clamor, and clamor into open mutiny. In the thick of it, Moses and Aaron stood between the people and a fate that could have been final, between a sweeping divine response and the survival of a nation. From the tent of meeting, God's response began to form as both mercy and judgment. Before the judgment was pronounced, Moses did what prophets and intercessors had always done. He fell before God's presence and pleaded for mercy on behalf of the people. He reminded God of the reputation among the nations, appealed to the promises to the patriarchs, and begged that the nation not be consumed for the sake of God's name. Moses' intercession is a window into the heart of leadership, an insistence that the leader stands between the people and the God who is righteous. Yet the narrative is careful to avoid portraying God as capricious. The judgment that followed was not anger unleashed for punishment's sake, but the solemn consequence of a people choosing unbelief over covenant. The sentence that God declared carried the weight of a generation's loss. The spies had spent 40 days walking the land. The sentence would make them spend 40 years walking because of their refusal to trust. 40, again the number of testing, of formation, became 40 years of wandering. The promise did not dissolve. God did not scrape the covenant from the record. But the consequence was severe. The generation that refused to move in faith would not inherit the land they had spied. Children under 20 would, in time, step into the inheritance. Those hardened by the refusal would fall away in the wilderness. In that hard calculus, faith and sight diverged into two different destinies. There was an exception in the decree that burned like a lantern of hope. Joshua and Caleb were singled out. Because they had followed the Lord wholeheartedly, because they kept their eyes on promise rather than size or sight, they would enter the land and receive their inheritance. It was a quiet vindication, no vaunting trumpets, but an irrevocable declaration that faith endures beyond the verdicts of the crowd. And yet the consequences were not a simple moral ledger. The 10 spies who had forged the report of fear met a swift, tragic end. The narrative tells of their demise, a curse upon those who led a nation into despair. The camp itself would be sentenced to 40 years of wandering, a period marked by funerals and a slow recalibration of communal identity. The land itself would not be denied to Israel forever. The land remained a promise, but the pathway to it was barred by a generation's unbelief. Pause and consider what was at stake. The men who reported abundance delivered both the material evidence and the spiritual test. Those who refused to trust turned the orchard into a trap. It is a strange and bitter thing. Abundance can become an instrument of fear when people measure God's promises with the yardstick of their courage. The spies had handed each family in the camp a forked path. Follow sight and remain in place, or follow promise and march toward conflict with the understanding that God's presence, not human strength, would write the victory. At the center of this crisis stood Joshua and Caleb, two figures who now functioned as living parables. Their lives posed a question to the people. Will you allow the fear of what you see to shape the story of what God has said? Their answer cost them abuse, near stoning, and the burden of watching a generation die without seeing the fruit of their testimony fulfilled. Yet their fidelity to the promise set the stage for a future that would be shaped by faith rather than by fear. It is in these breaks, the spaces where campfire gossip becomes public policy, that leadership is tested. Moses, who had seen the burning bush and conversed with the Almighty, stepped into intercession. He argued that consuming the people would be to tarnish the reputation of God before the nations, that God's patience shaped the theological landscape as much as the events did. Moses' appeal offers us a theological hinge. Divine holiness and divine faithfulness move together. Justice and mercy are not opposites, but two sides of the same covenantal coin. Yet mercy did not remove consequence. When a people collectively refuses to trust, the cost is paid in time. 40 years of wandering would become a long curriculum in dependence, a generation-long classroom where the lessons of obedience, presence, and covenant would be learned the hard way. The children would learn to ask for what their parents had refused. They would receive what those parents had lost. The land would still be there, waiting, patient as a promise, but the path to it would involve graves, tests, and growth measured in seasons. Before the crisis fully unfurled into the slow mechanics of wandering, there was a final scene of rupture and pleading. The assembly, angered by the two faithful witnesses, surged with mob instinct. Stones glittered in hands that had not learned the restraint of covenant. The intent to stone Joshua and Caleb was real, near, and mortal. The nation was a breath away from killing the very men who clung to God's promise and who spoke of obedience as the clearest prayer. In the tent of meeting, Moses interceded as thunder rolled through divine presence. The assembly was spared total destruction, but not spared the consequences of its choice. Here lies a question for us. What does it cost a community to choose fear over faith? For Israel at Kadesh, the price was time, the lives of that generation spent in the wilderness, the promise postponed but not revoked. For Joshua and Caleb, the cost was witness. They would carry the grief of seeing their countrymen forfeit immediate entry into what God had prepared. Yet their fidelity would secure them a place in the story of fulfillment. Their names would be carved into the memory of the people as those who saw destiny and refused to bow to sight. This was the hinge moment. 40 days of reconnaissance had become the pivot for 40 years of pilgrimage. The grapes on a pole had been proof of the land's bounty. The fear-torn report had turned that symbol into an object of debate. The covenant endured. The promise persisted. But the nation had, by choice, split its own destiny into two paths, one marked by fear and death, another marked by faith and inheritance. If you find a pulse in this story, a hand on your own throat, a question about hearing God's whispers over the noise of a frightened crowd, hold that pulse. For the story of Joshua and Caleb does not end here. It unfolds into the long, hard work of formation, a wilderness in which leaders are forged by proximity to God and by the slow erosion of presumption. It moves from the thunder of judgment into the quiet apprenticeship of a new generation. If this cinematic take on Scripture sharpens your heart and draws you into the drama of divine promise, subscribe to follow the series. There is more ahead. The training of Joshua at Moses' side, the grave realities of 40 years of wandering, and the final arc where promise and presence meet at the riverbank. But before we turn that page, stay with the image of Kadesh, a camp torn between abundance and anxiety, a cluster of grapes borne to the mouth of a fearful people, two men standing like a rock in a sea of doubt. The next scenes will not erase the sorrow of what unfolded here. They will show how leadership is prepared in the shadow of judgment, how patient faith is cultivated over decades, and how God's faithfulness moves toward fulfillment even when human hearts delay it. As the dust of Kadesh settled into the grooves of memory, a long season began, one marked by graves and by teaching, by funerals and by formation. Joshua, who had stood up in that assembly, did not disappear into the crowd. He remained near Moses, learning not only the techniques of leadership, but the source of leadership, the presence of God. Caleb, whose name means wholehearted, quietly continued in his trust, waiting for the day when the promise would belong to him in deed and in land. The scene closes on their faces, resolute, patient, and unmoved by the shockwaves of a people's fear. It is worth lingering on what patience looked like for them. It was not passive resignation. To wait in faith is a form of active engagement. It is living as a covenant person in a covenant community that has chosen a different path. For Joshua, waiting meant being formed at the feet of a master and learning the theology of presence, that victories were not won by strategy alone, but by God's abiding nearness. For Caleb, waiting meant a perseverance of heart so steady that when the day of claim came, his step across the threshold of Hebron would be the natural progression of a life built on trust. Even as Kadesh faded into the distance and the sentence settled upon the camp like a long shadow, seeds were being sown for future triumphs. The promise had been unveiled, then postponed. The adventure had been announced, then deferred. But in the deferral lay the hard work of character, the slow shaping of leaders who could carry a nation into a land that would not be surrendered by mere speech. The rest of this story moves from crisis to cultivation, from the thunderous words of judgment to the quiet, sometimes brutal apprenticeship that would prepare Joshua and Caleb to lead a people into fulfillment. And so we leave the camp at Kadesh, with the memory of grapes heavy on a pole and the echo of two men whose faith drew an outline of destiny. Ahead lie years of wandering that will teach an entire nation how to become a people capable of possessing a land. Ahead lie moments of testing that will show whether the promise belonged to the people's hope or to God's patience. Ahead, too, will be the scenes where God's presence parts waters once more, and where memorial stones will be set down as witness to what faith had finally accomplished. But that is the next part of the voyage. For now the assembly disperses under the same sky, a mixture of sorrow and stubbornness, as the caravan of consequence begins its slow, unavoidable march. The caravan of consequence moved like a slow ledger of loss, tents folded away, flocks led under clouded skies, a people carrying graves in their steps. 40 years unrolled before them, not as an abstract punishment, but as a curriculum of dependence. Graves opened in the dust, names were read out and buried. The camp that had once expected to march into orchards instead learned to keep vigil beside tombs. Time became the teacher that had been refused at Kadesh. The sons grew tall where their fathers had wilted. The manna continued, but the taste of it changed as generations learned to trust differently. In that long season, Joshua did not vanish into resignation. His apprenticeship deepened into a craft of presence. He walked where Moses walked, he listened where Moses listened. The mantle of leadership was not a garment that fell at a single instant. It was a formation forged by repetition, the steady seeing and naming of God's nearness. We catch glimpses of Joshua learning the logic of spiritual warfare, that a leader's authority is rooted not merely in strategy, but in the cloud that rests over the tent, in the voice that meets Moses at the tent's entrance, in the law read aloud beside the ark. The victory at Rephidim teaches a discipline. When hands are raised in intercession, the posture of leadership matters. Victory is tied to the presence that sustains it. Caleb's waiting was quieter but no less resolute. His name, wholehearted, was not merely a label but the measure of a life. Where others had allowed sight to rewrite promise, Caleb's heart kept its ledger with God. He moved through the years as a man who had staked his hope on memory, the memory of the burning bush, the memory of deliverance at the sea, the memory of God's faithfulness to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That memory was not nostalgic, it was tactical. It kept him from being seduced by the softness of comfort or by the pragmatics of fear. He married faith to patience until the two became indistinguishable. At home among his tribe, he labored and trained his sons, kept his household ready for a day he could not yet see. The wilderness education was not only grief and patient labor. It was a school of law and covenant, of statutes read on hilltops and in stones set by streams. It was the slow honing of a people who would learn finally that a land is possessed when a people are formed to receive it. Moses' leadership shaped Joshua by proximity. The one who would go forward into the promised land began to bear the look of a man accustomed to the presence of God, the same look that once made a tent the center of a people's life. It is in formation, not in spectacle, that character is forged. 40 years passed. The generation that had hardened its heart fell in the dust. A new cohort stood up, children of the wilderness who had not tasted the bondage their parents recalled, who had learned to ask for what their parents had refused. The narrative's arc turned like a shoulder, finally facing its destination. The promise that had been postponed did not wither. It waited, patient as an anchored ship. When the time came, Moses passed the torch. God's command was clear: appoint Joshua as the leader to succeed him. The transition was not merely administrative, it was theological and symbolic. The mantle of authority moved from one generation's hands to another's. But the source of that authority remained the same, the Lord of hosts who had been faithful. Moses' final acts of commissioning were both farewell and commissioning. He laid hands in the presence of Israel, recalled their history, and declared the promise's continuity. Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo, and from the heights looked across the breadth of the land he would not enter. There is a reverence in that scene, a great leader given a long view and then released from the battlefield into the silence of death. His death was not an ending of God's guidance, but a hinge into the next chapter of covenantal faithfulness. Joshua stepped into his role with a weight that had been tempered in Kadesh and polished by years beside a prophet. The charge given to him was short and thunderous: be strong and courageous. It is a command that travels through time in Scripture, a phrase that binds a leader to God's promise. Strength and courage are not self-made. They depend on a continual turning toward the one who sent them. The people who would follow Joshua needed a different kind of leadership, not the miraculous rescue that happened once and could be depended on as routine, but the steady, God-centered authority of a man who had watched a generation die rather than deny God's word. Preparation for crossing the Jordan involved both spiritual readiness and visible remembrance. God told Joshua to gather the people and to command the priests to carry the Ark of the Covenant and to step into the river. When the priests' feet touched the water, the current piled up and the river stood in a heap and the people crossed on dry ground. History's echo of the Red Sea, a corporate sign that God's presence accompanied the new leadership. 12 men, one from each tribe, were commanded to take 12 stones from the riverbed and set them up where they camped that night. Those stones would be a memorial, a path of memory for children who had never seen the sea part, evidence that faith has a habit of leaving tangible traces. The stones were witness. Stones as narrative devices recur, memorials that speak when humans are gone. On the other side of the Jordan, at Gilgal, the Israelites performed rites of initiation. Circumcision renewed the covenantal body. The festival of unleavened bread marked the spiritual rhythm. The land was now at their feet, but it would be fought for and kept by the presence of God. The first major obstacle was Jericho, a city of walls that rose like a challenge to the heavens. Here the narrative gives us one of its most cinematic sequences. Not a siege in the conventional sense, but a commanded procession, trumpets sounding, priests leading with the ark, the people circling the city for 7 days. On the 7th day the shout came, and the walls fell. Jericho collapsed. The ruin was total and awe-striking. Rahab, who had hidden the spies earlier, was spared, a small mercy woven into the larger tapestry of divine judgment and covenantal fidelity. The fall of Jericho introduced the principle that victory in the Promised Land would often arrive through the strange economy of God's actions. Not all victories came by might. Some came by obedience that the world could not predict. But the story does not allow a simplistic triumphalism. Shortly after Jericho came Ai and defeat. Israel, confident after the collapse of a fortified city, misstepped. The narrative points to sin within the camp as the reason. One man's theft violated the covenant, and that fractured the people's right standing before God. Israel was routed, and hearts heavy with confusion had to learn again that success in covenant warfare hinged on communal holiness as much as on military maneuver. The sin was exposed, the culprits dealt with, and only then could they go forward. This pattern repeats on a larger scale across the campaigns. The southern and the northern wars that Joshua undertook were not merely a string of conquests, but a series of encounters that demonstrated the theology of presence. The Lord fought for Israel. Hailstones confused cities, kings capitulated, and strategy combined with the hand of heaven. In the southern campaign, the Gibeonites tricked Israel into a covenant that would bind them to mercy. In the northern campaign, a confederacy of kings arose and was routed by a campaign that culminated with the day the sun stood still. An extraordinary claim recorded and left without a naturalistic smoothing. The narrative presents these interventions soberly, as acts of God, decisive and not to be mimicked, but as signs that the divine presence moved in history on behalf of a people who bore the name of the covenant. Among those wartime pictures, one figure's patience translated into real estate. Caleb reappears like a man who owes no apology for waiting. At 85, he would claim Hebron. His claim is not a sudden discovery, but the unfolding of a pledge made decades earlier. He reminds Joshua of the vow that had been made and asks, with the confidence that belongs to the wholehearted, for the piece of land he had been promised. He enters battle. He displaces the Anakim, giants whose memory had been the cause of fear years before. The image is stark. The man who once refused to bow to sight now stands in the ruins of the very terror the spies had described. Caleb's ownership of Hebron becomes an emblem of patient inheritance. It tells us that promises can outlive generations. They wait with dignity and eventually meet the perseverance of the faithful. The allotment of the land that follows is bureaucratic in texture but theological in meaning. Tribes received portions, boundaries were set, cities were named. Levites were given no territorial inheritance but towns within the territories, maintaining the spiritual center of Israel. The distribution reflects a people learning to live within limits and to bind their identity to places marked by promise. Joshua himself received Timnath-Serah in the hill country of Ephraim, an inheritance that closes the loop of his journey from attendant to ruler to landholder. Amid the victories and marshalling of borders, there are reminders that possession requires stewardship. Cities of refuge were established, towns for the Levites were set, and the covenant's liturgical life continued at central places like Shiloh. The land's peace was not an immediate utopia. The people still wrestled with internal fidelity. The very act of settling required the repetition of covenantal commitment, justice, loyalty, and the remembrance of God's acts in history. Joshua's role matured into that of elder and covenant tutor, one who rehearsed the story until it took hold in the bones of a generation. As Joshua matured into statesman, his voice gathered the authority of experience. Near the end of his life, he called the people together at Shechem. There, amid stones heavy with memory, stones that had been set up as witnesses, Joshua rehearsed the past, recalled the deeds of God, and urged the nation to choose. His challenge is sharp and pastoral. The people must decide whom they will serve. He evoked the history of idolatry and loyalty, of famine and deliverance. "Choose this day whom you will serve," he declared, and with the clarity of an ancient prophet he placed the alternative plainly before them. His words were not a mere sermon, they were a covenantal summons. He placed before Israel the names of the gods of their parents, and the Lord who had delivered them from Egypt and led them through the wilderness. The people answered with a vow. They would serve the Lord. They would put away foreign gods. In that farewell, there is a pastoral core. Leadership culminates not in accumulation of power, but in a final insistence that the people remember who they are. Joshua's last acts were didactic and covenantal. He wrote and copied the law into a place where future generations might encounter it. He set up a stone under an oak by the sanctuary, where the people renewed their vows. Then Joshua died at the age of 110, old and full of days, and was buried in his own inheritance. His death is the closing of the human chapter of an epic, but not the end of the covenantal story. The land continued to be a contested promise, and the destiny of the people would require ongoing fidelity. The narrative allows no myth of secure permanence. The rest from war that Israel attained was fragile and dependent on ongoing allegiance. The story of Joshua and Caleb closes on a note that blends triumph with warning. The promise had been fulfilled to those who believed. The land lay claimed by heirs who had known the cost of faith. Yet the book of Joshua girds its victory with admonition. Blessing follows obedience, and the faithfulness of God always arrives with a call to human fidelity. Caleb's victory and Joshua's conquests are not trophies to flaunt, but memorials to warn. Promises that are received by faith must be stewarded by fidelity. The covenantal life requires both courage and constancy. If we step back and hold this narrative up to our own lives, the themes pulse like an artery. What does it mean to wait for a promise under the sun of disappointment? How do we carry witness when the crowd cries for safety and the stones glitter in hands, ready to silence truth? Joshua and Caleb give us a twofold image: leadership formed by proximity to God, and faith that does not vacillate with the changing temperature of popular opinion. They model endurance as an active stance, not a passive linger. Caleb's claim at Hebron is a sermon in muscle. The long wait, when lived faithfully, yields not merely comfort, but concrete inheritance. There are spiritual mechanics here worth attending to. Faith that outlasts a generation is cultivated in the soil of memory and shaped by the habits of obedience. The memorial stones at the Jordan are not nostalgic trinkets, but pedagogical devices. They were placed so that children would ask and elders would say, "This is why we cross. This is what God has done." Rituals, recitations, and traditions become scaffolding for faith that will survive an age of fear. Joshua's commissioning reminds leaders that their authority is derivative, drawn from the Lord, and that courage is a commanded posture in the face of uncertainty. The account also forces a communal reflection. Israel's collective choice at Kadesh had consequences that rippled for decades. That teaches a stern lesson about the public nature of faith. Our decisions as communities shape not only our present, but the spiritual climate into which our children are born. To choose fear over obedience is to mortgage the future. Conversely, to steady a community with testimony, memory, and faithful leadership invests in a harvest beyond our earthly span. The theology of waiting is subtle. Waiting is not passive resignation. It is a disciplined, expectant stance that keeps covenantal memory alive while refusing the seduction of immediate, lesser securities. Caleb's life shows that waiting may involve risk, labor, and sometimes solitary perseverance. It can also mean watching the promise pass by those who refused it while remaining bent toward the eventual fulfillment. That posture is costly, but it is holy. What of the miraculous interventions in this story? They are robust and decisive. The Red Sea and the Jordan, hailstones that toppled armies, the walls of Jericho that fell, each is narrated reverently. God acted. These acts do not serve as a blueprint for replication. They anchor the narrative in a God who moves in history. They underline a theological reality. Victory depends on presence, not program. The Lord's interventions underline that human plans are subordinate to divine agency. Strategy has its place. Holiness and presence have primacy. There are still questions that press in upon modern ears. How should the lessons of conquest be heard in a world sensitive to violence? The text itself frames conquest as covenantal rectification and territorial fulfillment of a promise, not as an arbitrary gush of power. The narrative insists on justice and on the seriousness of sin, but it also insists on mercy. See Rahab and the Gibeonites. The story refuses easy simplification. It requires moral discernment when read into contexts not its own. The heart of it remains pastoral. God keeps promises and calls a people to live in faithful response. As this epic draws to its human end, consider the qualities the story commends: courage that is born of memory, leadership that forms rather than conquers, patience that is active, not passive, a covenantal imagination that leaves memorial stones so that children might learn from tellers who refuse to be silent. Joshua's life and Caleb's claim are twin beacons, one formed in proximity to prophecy and law, the other steadfast in personal fidelity. Together, they make the portrait of a people who learned, at the cost of a generation, to be fit to possess what had been promised to them. Perhaps the most piercing question for us is simple. Which report will we believe when faced with a promise? Will we align with the 10 who measured reality by fear, or with the 2 who keyed reality to God's word? The stakes are communal and personal. Fear persuades the crowd to stay. Faith sends a few forward. The narrative does not flinch from the cost, the funerals, the lonely witness, the trials, but it insists that fidelity wins the long game. There is a consoling finality in Caleb's Hebron and in the stones at Gilgal. They tell a truth that reverberates. Promises kept by God sometimes require human time to mature, but God's memory outlives human fear. The land was possessed not by the mightiest army alone, but by a people who, through teaching, ritual, and steely patience, became the kind of people capable of receiving it. In that transformation lies the pastoral application. We must practice faith in ways that train our children. We must erect memorials so memory does not erode. We must let leaders be formed at the feet of those who have known God's presence. So where does that leave us with our own promises? Perhaps you are in a season of Kadesh, torn between the sight of obstacles and the whisper of promise. Maybe you carry a Joshua's readiness to lead or a Caleb's quiet persistence. The story grants a space for both, the public testimony that urges a people forward and the private fidelity that holds on to a promise against the din. If the promise you are waiting for seems delayed, remember that delay is not denial. God's timing is not our stalling. It may be the patient contouring of character. If Joshua and Caleb's story touches something in you, consider this concrete call. Name one promise you have allowed sight to outspeak, and set a memorial stone, literal or symbolic, that will remind you and your household of the covenant. Teach the story to a younger person. Rehearse the deeds God has done for you in ways that will outlast your fear. Leadership is not only for elders. It is the daily act of choosing courage and of refusing to let the crowd silence truth. The epic ends with a final insistence. God's promises endure, and faith that will last is formed in the crucible of time, memory, and obedience. Caleb's Hebron stands as a testimony to patient inheritance. Joshua's stones stand as a testimony to communal memory. The land was taken because a people, imperfect but covenantally formed, learned to live by God's presence. That lesson travels across the ages to every life that must choose between the word of God and the report of fear. If Joshua and Caleb's faith encouraged you, share this story and hold tighter to the promise you are waiting on.